What you're seeing isn't Victoria 3. It's Dune Spice Wars. But the reason I want to talk about Victoria 3 is related to this game. I really enjoy Dune Spice Wars. I think it's well designed, relatively bug-free, and enjoyable. But I don't recommend it to everyone. In fact, I have been debating whether to recommend it to a good friend of mine. This friend is the person who introduced me to Age of Empires in the late 90s. We played Age of Empires 2, Age of Empires 3, Age of Mythology, and so on. But not Empire Earth. I've hesitated recommending the game or just buying it on Steam sale as a gift because it's a different kind of RTS. It discourages pure murderball gameplay in favor of diversified mechanics that integrate all together for a different kind of game experience. So it's a great game that doesn't get a recommendation from me for every gamer because it's not everyone's cup of tea. But I see it as an excellent game that makes me happy that I bought it. But Victoria is a bit different. I have a ton of time in Victoria 3. I have videos on Victoria 3. They aren't good videos, but I still love that I did an entire video on beating the historical Russian famine by ending grain production and spamming livestock ranches. This is information I posted on the Victoria Wiki over a decade ago. Yeah, I have a long history with this franchise. Which makes it all the more surprising that I don't recommend Victoria to more people. I don't mean Victoria 3, I mean all of them. Victoria has always been a niche franchise that never easily fit into categories. Sure, it's a grand strategy game, but if you played Europa Universalis 4 and I plopped Victoria 2 in front of you and said, "Get to work, gaming pleb," you'd be forgiven for making memes instead of playing. But that doesn't mean they are bad games. As we have seen, there are plenty of good games that simply shouldn't be recommended to certain people. No one should bother recommending The Lord of the Rings Rise to War to me, since I generally hate mobile games no matter how good they are. Yeah, I'm not buying Aragorn for 99 cents. That ain't happening. I don't have any room to build a fellowship hall, you numbskulls. Spoiler, it's not good. But unlike Dune, Victoria 3 has a lot of anger from players and much lower review scores. And this leads me to the question I want to explore. Do I really enjoy playing Victoria 3? Am I overlooking all the problems and just really excited about the good parts? Or am I trapped in my sunk cost? When I start a new game of Victoria 3, am I just high on cope? Well, let's talk about that. This is obviously a video essay and not my typical exploration of game mechanics or odd AI behavior. It's also not a typical, I have a thesis about Victoria 3 and will expound upon it at length. This video is more about talking through how I feel about the game's failures and triumphs while looking at how others view the game. We may not even draw a definitive conclusion from all of this, but if you come with me on this journey, I promise you will at least get to see Victoria 3 in a new light. Or you'll despise me and everything I stand for. It could go either way. Let me give you some structure, though. I want to talk about some things I like and dislike about Victoria 3. Then I want to look at what others say about the game through reviews and forum posts. I want to compare Victoria 3's gameplay to some other games. Yeah, if you like Middle-earth as a setting, just go ahead and grab a fifth of vodka now. Go on, I'll wait for you. Update error. I have sufficient storage. I even uninstalled Harebrained Schemes Battletech for this. I've got 121 gigs of space. My internet connection is fine. Okay, back to the video. Anyway, after all that, I want to talk about what I think is the structural cause of some player angst. So, what are some things I like about Victoria 3? Honestly, I like the entire standard of living mechanic. Yes, I know good substitution can be a mess, but this mechanic is so much better than what we had in Victoria 2. But in Victoria 3, purchases are dictated by current standard of living. If you could have a laborer with standard of living 63, they would buy the same stuff as this capitalist. In fact, thanks to consumer goods prices and income, smart players can structure the economy to drive up consumer goods demand by doing things to raise SOL. And the buy packages for each standard of living level have a real logic to them. A lot of players don't know this, but the buy packages are set up to try and mimic how purchases might be made by these kinds of pops in the real world. The game doesn't communicate it very well, but take a look at the information on the wiki. So, your country is great at producing fabric and regular clothes. That's a good deal for pops at SOLs 1 through 39. But this pop, this French capitalist pop, will never buy fabric or regular clothes at all. This kind of a pop only buys luxury clothes. That's it. And their demand for luxury clothes, as you can see from the wiki, increases exponentially. So your oil barons and these guys who own the automobile industries in Normandy, they are going to consume vast quantities of luxury clothes, but they are never going to buy any products that help the local dollar stores stay in business. So the system in Victoria 3 has a certain logic to it, and because it's tied to standard of living, it is both flexible to game situation and it is also economy driven. Buying power matters, not arbitrary needs or dollar amounts. I also really like how gold stockpiling and debt are handled. The gold debt mechanic is what I call an integrated mechanic, beyond the simple use of currency. It works well with the lack of stockpiles, which is a fundamental part of Victoria 3's game design. There are no stockpiles in the game, and the game discourages the stockpiling of cash. As you can see here, even though I'm currently in debt, if I had piles of gold reserves, I could only stockpile up to a certain limit before diminishing returns would set in. And to the credit of the developers, the game's design incentivizes the action some political leaders in the period undertook. Instead of stockpiling 136 million gold for a rainy day or a war, I just raise taxes when I need more money or a huge war breaks out. And the debt part works well too. The game makes debt a viable choice. Instead of just being a total waste, your country's debt is integral to the economic health of your country. As you can see here, France has 265 million in possible credit and an interest rate of 1.2%, and I'm currently 62 million in debt. Your credit limit is dynamically dictated, though. This is not an arbitrary number. As you can see, there's a base amount, but I'm getting all of this credit limit from the buildings in my country. The credit limit is ultimately dictated by all the buildings in your country, 5% of your GDP, and a flat 100 grand just to give small countries some flexibility. This setup might seem pointless. I mean, why bother doing it this way? But the reality of this game design is that even though Victoria 3 doesn't have a real banking sector, again, these aren't banks, these are buildings that have cash reserves. The economic health of your country ultimately dictates credit availability. Sure, I could run France into the ground right now if I wanted to, but as I do so, you'll notice that my credit limit will contract. So not only will tax revenue decline as I destroy the economy, but I can't borrow my way to victory. Credit markets tighten as the economy collapses. The interest rates are well designed too. Now, this is my current interest rate. I'm paying 14 grand and some change yearly on France's debt. And you can see that all of these things are impacting the current interest rate. This is not realistic in the sense that most people familiar with credit markets would understand them. These interest rates are dictated by my technologies and by my status as a great power and like some policies I have in place. It's not dictated by supply and demand of credit or other economic indicators. But the good design part of the interest rates is found in how they pay out and the mechanics they link to. This interest that I'm paying on my national debt is paid to my creditors who hold my debt, which are all of these buildings. And specifically, the pops who have ownership shares in these buildings. And since tech and country status largely dictates interest rates, players are incentivized to be more willing to take on debt as they become more powerful and move up the tech tree. China in 1936 just isn't going to get the same interest rates as France is right now, no matter how big China's economy is. But here as France, not only do I have more credit available and lower interest rates, but borrowing that money from my own economy means that servicing that debt back to my own buildings lines the pockets of my own pops. Sure, I could have 265 million in debt, But as long as I can service that debt and expand the economy, I'm essentially paying dividends to my own pops, the people who own these buildings. It's genius. So if I like all of these things, what do I dislike about Victoria 3? Well, performance is one. I'm running the game in the background at speed 5 right now, and there's no other way to say it. Performance in patch 1.6 somehow got worse than it was. I have saved games as France, Germany, and Austria past 1927 that I've been using for footage and tests, but I don't normally go past that point simply because the game performance is terrible. I don't pretend to understand all of the reasons Victoria 3 has performance problems. I've heard all kinds of reasons. It's the pops, it's assimilation and immigration, it's trade, it's warfare. It all sounds like these problems could seriously hurt performance. But I would also believe you if you said that ancient aliens built the pyramids and the pyramids are causing Victoria 3 to have performance issues.
But if the pyramid was really designed as a gigantic power plant, how was that power applied?
I don't know what's causing it, but it's irritating for a whole list of reasons. I want to make something clear, though. I'm not one of those gamers that will make a 30-minute YouTube video complaining about dropped frames. Sure, I'll make a 40-minute video about fuel drum modules on tanks, but dropped frames? Come on, I have more important things to worry about. But the slowdown in Victoria 3 becomes an issue because, again, of integrated mechanics. Victoria 3 is technically real-time pausable, but it has some mechanics that proc off the daily tick while others proc off the weekly tick. And because it can be paused, a lot of players will pause, set up new stuff, then roll the clock until it's time for something to change or diplomatic play fires. The loop includes running the game at higher speeds sometimes to wait for the payoff of certain actions being taken. Another thing that I really hate is front splitting. You cannot fathom how irritating it is to have fronts split up and armies then being forced to travel to a split front. Like this army here. The 5th Austrian Army, even though it is still mobilizing, is moving to the Kyushu Ryukyu Islands front. It's going to take 116 days to get there. That's this front right here. The one that formed after I invaded Kyushu. Warfare is meant to be indirect. It is fundamental to the game's mechanics that players do not directly micro armies. But front splitting results in insanity that requires player intervention to solve when it can even be solved. Frustration is not a strong enough description for how I feel when it happens. This tiny front, I'm not going to be able to get an army here before Japan does, because I got to ship armies all the way from either Austria or my colonial empire in Africa. And I cannot invade with more than one army in the state, so once the landing is successful, if the front splits, there's nothing I can do to stop Japan from just moving a small army here and removing my progress on Kyushu. In other words, unless I'm in the local neighborhood of Japan, invading Kyushu is stupid. I need to either invade Shikaku or somewhere else that won't cause a front split to happen. A third thing I dislike about the game is how ports and convoys are balanced. In this case, I understand the design idea. It's clear that the goal of having ports and convoys limited by states is meant to give countries with larger coastlines a real advantage in naval stuff. And while there were historically some countries with disproportionately large merchant navies that also had small coastlines, the reality is that most of the big naval powers were countries with lots of coastline. The mechanic is also designed so that countries with smaller coastlines are easier to blockade, since blockades in Victoria 3 boil down to sinking convoys. Sinking 5,000 of 50,000 British convoys has less of an impact than sinking 5,000 of 5,000 Austrian. But the weird thing about the current balance is that instead of incentivizing overseas trade, the game encourages land trade routes. First, because those don't require convoys until they surpass the land transport capacity. This is what I'm talking about here. You can see that all of these trade routes I have right here, these are all land-based trade routes that don't require convoys. And some of them are fairly lucrative, but I'm using all of these export routes to dump my cheap goods on foreign markets precisely because I don't need convoys to move those goods around. In real life, the profitability of trade routes would, at least partially, dictate whether shipping oil to Britain was worth the effort. Sure, tariffs, embargoes, and shipping costs affected this sort of thing in real life, but we're talking about a system that boils down to Britain wants to pay $120 a barrel for crude, we're only getting $80 a barrel at home. Ship that black gold. In Victoria 3, big player economies instead face a gameplay choice that boils down to, do I have enough convoys to ship the goods in question? So you can see I'm shipping motors to Spain right here at a cost of 9,000 convoys, and I'm generating 13,000 in revenue. This route is using 3,600 convoys to generate only 1,000 in revenue. Since I am capped on convoys to some extent, this trade route may need to go away, not because it isn't profitable, but because there's just not enough convoys to ship it. That isn't how it would work in real life. In real life, you would just build more merchant shipping in order to ship those goods. You could even buy and rent shipping from other countries, which is something you can't really directly do in Victoria 3. Although, just to drive the point home, I am getting convoys from my dominions in this game. They are providing a decent number, but this Austria we are looking at right now is 100% capped in terms of convoys and techs. I've got my modern port set up. I literally cannot have any more merchant marine to ship my goods. And I have to make trade decisions based on that instead of just having an increasingly costly merchant marine or some other logarithmic scale. It's just literally like a cliff. Oh, I'm out of convoys. Well, I guess I can't export anything anymore, or import for that matter. So there are some things I dislike about Victoria 3. For those who know my content, most of these complaints shouldn't be a big surprise. I can really enjoy 90% of a game's content, but get extremely irritated by small abstractions that grind me the wrong way. Yes, I'm looking at you, carrier navs that don't shoot back. But when I read reviews or complaints about the game, I sometimes see issues being brought up that baffle me. Mobile game? Cookie clicker? Warfare lacks user input? Too abstracted. Every country is the same? Now you see why I feel like I might be trapped in cope instead of having genuine fun. If other people have these complaints, it's no wonder they are angry at Victoria 3's design. Victoria as a franchise has always been willing to reward spreadsheet levels of player interaction, more so than even Hearts of Iron 4. Yes, Hearts of Iron 4 rewards knowing even the tiniest of math details in various game formula, but talking about how many civilian factories to greed before Danzig or war pales in comparison to discussions in Victoria 2 like this one. Victoria as a franchise has been famous for its opaqueness. I'm not really one to like strategy games being hard simply because the player doesn't know how interest rates are computed. Victoria 2 had its opaque elements all over the game. It's hard to see them now as a veteran player, but I realized that if I was going to teach someone to play Victoria 2, I wouldn't even know where to begin. But what I'm addressing here is that Victoria 2, viewed from the outside, can seem unintuitive and overwhelming. For me, this means that when I see Vic 3 trying to make itself more accessible, I applaud the idea. I don't ever want to be the gamer who thinks that a game being inaccessible is the same thing as being fun or interesting. The exception to this is NATO counters. Because I can't read Hearts of Iron 4's regular counters, I'm stuck using NATO counters even though they are opaque for a lot of my audience. But that just proves the rule, doesn't it? You can toggle them on or off with minimal effort. But I don't think for 1 minute what we see in Victoria 3 is deliberate dumbing down or an attempt to go casual. If it was, I would recommend it to more people. Like, I'd recommend the Ancient Aliens game on Steam to my mother before I'd recommend Victoria 3 to her. Not because I think Ancient Aliens is a better game, but because I think my mother, despite her genius level IQ, would find Victoria 3 too much work to play. This is where I went to get some outside help. I reached out to my community about how they view Victoria 3. And a big complaint was lack of user interaction or input. These folks seem to reinforce the idea that you, as the player, don't do enough when playing the game. This would be somewhat in line with comparisons to cookie clicker and mobile games. Mobile games are famous for their wait unless you pay gameplay. But is Victoria 3 really like that? I don't know, I never play mobile games. I'm so tied to mouse and keyboard that playing a game on my phone feels like a dolphin trying to use an arc welder. I'm so keyboard bound that I don't even use Steam Link to play my Steam library on my phone. So if the accusation is that Victoria 3 is like a mobile game and lacks interaction like a proper game, then I need to actually play a mobile game. Based on my love for Lord of the Rings and the reviews I've seen, I pick Lord of the Rings Rise of War. Let's play it and see how it shakes out. I noticed that I have yet to even run out of resources. Like these big fat piles of resources. It's time. I am time limited. Okay, we'll go ahead and do grain tribute, I guess. I don't need a fellowship hall, I don't think. Okay, the apothecary is done. So I need a level 6 conscription post, which means we need to upgrade this. This is going to take 5 minutes. Again, I don't need... Like, I have all the resources I could want. There's no strategy here. This is... There's no, like, strategy here that I can see right now. I don't need interlocking chains. We'll go ahead and, I guess we'll start that upgrade. I don't need interlocking production schemes. This is just... What the f*** am I doing with my life? This game makes me sad and angry at the same time. I would love a new grand strategy game set in Middle-earth. Maybe in the Second Age. There's plenty of material there to work with in terms of lore and mechanics. But playing this game for an hour on 2 separate days shows me a whole pile of terrible. Not once was I ever limited by resources. In fact, I can't even see how I would ever run out of resources. My armies seem to be less customizable than armies in Europa Universalis 2. They rely purely on bigger number is better. Every construction seems to be something you can speed up at the cost of premium currency, but even with buildings upgraded, I was just getting more resources I didn't need and my armies couldn't be improved. The rings seem to be just a tool for clearing fog of war to no purpose, and for some reason, deer and pigs count as dangerous opponents for legendary heroes like Gimli and Faramir. And even taking a deer or pig tile just adds more grain.
Red meat off the bone!
And let me be clear, because you can speed up and complete constructions by paying premium currencies while you are also sitting on piles of resources you could never spend, the goal of the game design is to get you to spend real money. This game design isn't wait for your upgrade and do other stuff and hope you time the upgrade properly. Yeah, you need to strategically decide when to upgrade with the lag time taken into account. In Dune Spice Wars, upgrading your capital takes time and a pile of resources. There are strategic trade-offs to picking a specific upgrade and buying it at a specific time. Like, there's no point in getting the Chome upgrade until you have enough spice production in place to utilize the price increases properly and have techs in place to push prices high enough to properly proc the bonuses. In Rise of War, it's just a tool to get you to spend money. And that makes me think for a moment. What am I doing when I play Rise to War versus Victoria 3? Let's look at my playing Victoria 3. Look, Victoria 3 isn't a game you get sweaty playing. It's a game you play while sipping a refreshing beverage and calmly thinking about your moves. I consider most grand strategy games to fit this mold except for Hearts of Iron 4 competitive multiplayer, and even then I find it weird that some groups refuse to allow pauses. I mean, it's Hearts of Iron 4, not esports StarCraft. But if I saw someone livestream Victoria 3 and they were clicking constantly, I would be really confused. I think this gets into the weird place where Victoria is as a game. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Victoria 3 is not like a mobile game or cookie clicker. It's not just the lack of microtransactions to speed up wait times, but the overall flow of design. Rise to War is designed to make you want to cough up dollars to speed up the game's waits. The way it handles resources, creation and use of armies, and the use of your ring are all set up in the opposite of Victoria 3. In Victoria 3, from day one, I'm looking to strategically use my resources to maximize my efficiency. That means a lot of things. Maybe I'm building more construction sectors. Maybe I'm building iron mines and tool workshops to fuel those construction sectors. Maybe I'm trying to find a way out of Russian serfdom and Chinese traditionalism. Maybe I'm declaring an interest in Africa so I can send the Prussian army there to begin the long project of building a colonial empire. Maybe I'm looking at building up my bureaucracy so I can invest in more and better schools or the secret police. And maybe I'm holding off on outright conquering territory because the turmoil would make construction far more difficult there. This is a key component of gameplay in Victoria 3. I am making strategic choices from a point of scarcity. Note that in the release version, the scarcity looked very different because it was much easier to industrialize quickly, but then outstrip your ability to fuel those factories. At 1.6, thanks to Mappy and other big changes over time, you need to be more strategic earlier in the game. In mobile games like Rise to War, I'm not making choices because of scarcity. I have all the manpower, wood, grain, and stone I could possibly want. What I lack is gameplay time, so I'm faced with one strategic decision. Spend premium currency to complete projects faster or not. Note that in the 2 hours I played, I conquered a number of tiles and fought lots of battles, but I never needed more resources or anything else. I was just attacking tiles to do it. I had new troop types at one point, but I couldn't use them because of weird limits on army size. I'd win and lose battles and send Gimli home to get reinforced, but I never once cared about the manpower in question. But I want to acknowledge something I hadn't realized before. I don't think Victoria 3 is like a mobile game, but there is something fundamental to Victoria's game architecture that is both a flaw and a redeeming quality that makes the game feel like one. Victoria 3 may be a real-time grand strategy game, but it's actually a hybrid of real-time and turn-based gameplay. This game has both daily and weekly ticks where stuff happens. This difference is not atypical. Many other games have different types of ticks where certain kinds of actions take place. But Victoria 3 is heavily focused on construction and economy. And as far as I can tell, all economic activity and all construction take place on the weekly ticks. The daily ticks are used to resolve warfare, politics, and random events. I ran a new game as France. As you can see, I didn't do too well. Perfidious Albion dragged me into a number of pointless wars that I won, but that cost both of us a ton of cash to fight. What's relevant here is that as I played through and the game's performance slowed down over time, the more boring bits of the game involved me waiting for weekly ticks to complete so my economy could advance. Planning my economic development or political moves isn't boring. But the daily ticks that do nothing in economic terms are just that, empty time that means little when not at war. This means that Victoria 3 isn't really real time. Yes, there are actions taking place on daily ticks, but the core gameplay loop of economics and construction is closer to turn-based gameplay. The problem for players is that you're essentially waiting for turns while doing empty busy work. It's not just waiting for buildings to complete either. Buildings hire labor on weekly ticks. Barracks replace losses on weekly ticks. Naval bases create new dreadnoughts on weekly ticks. Taxes are collected on weekly ticks. And I think crimes against humanity in the Belgian Congo occur on weekly ticks. Even mortality from buildings and workforce ratios seems to proc off the weekly ticks. So yeah, the game is real-time when you are watching battles take place, fronts irritatingly split, convoys getting raided, and waiting for legislation events to fire. But ask yourself this, if Victoria 3 was turn-based on weekly ticks, would you even notice the difference other than having to press the end turn button? I don't think you would. And because warfare is abstracted into a part of gameplay with less player input than in Victoria 2, the stuff happening on daily ticks isn't that important. Thus, players feel like they're just waiting for stuff to happen. And that's the problem. Victoria 3 isn't really like a mobile game, but the weekly ticks in real time turn what could have been turn-based gameplay into real-time waiting. And the performance problems make waiting for those weekly ticks a bigger chore as the game goes on. With the added issue being that you can't even use premium currency to speed the game up. So turning back to my original question, am I just high on cope when I say that I like Victoria 3? No, I don't think so. I know a lot of people think it has a mobile game feel to it, but it's not really a mobile game. It's a real-time strategy game that has a fundamental game design issue related to its implementation. I don't know if Victoria 3 would feel better to players if it was turn-based, as that would make it seem far too different than its predecessor. The things happening on daily ticks are far less interesting and impactful than what's happening on the weekly, and this fundamental game design issue does hurt the reception of Victoria 3. Because let's be honest with ourselves for a moment. From PC strategy gamers, calling something a mobile game is a grave insult. And I think that about wraps it up. I wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to watch this video. I wanted to send a shout out to my channel members who got to see this video a little earlier than everyone else and were willing to work through a couple of different postings of this video as I was trying to make sure Content ID wasn't grabbing some of the footage and music. But I did want to thank everyone for going with me on this journey as we explored the good and the bad of Victoria 3 and discussed whether or not I am trapped in my own cope as a person who does enjoy Victoria 3 despite how much some people really dislike the game. If you liked what you see here, go ahead and drop a like and a sub on the video. And I do a lot of Hearts of Iron 4 content, but I still do some Victoria 3 content every now and then. I do have something cooking for Hearts of Iron 4 that I want to talk about. I want to talk about and explore some weird things that go on with Barbarossa in a single player game. But I haven't fully figured out how I want to deal with that just yet. So until that happens, I hope that you're having a pleasant day, and I will talk to all of you later.